Brazilian cinema is having a moment, and I'm here for it. Brazilian cinema is incredible, and it's so wonderful to see it being recognized internationally. Wagner Moura recently won a Golden Globe for his incredible work on The Secret Agent, directed by Kleber Mendonça Filho, and he said in his speech how, for Brazilians, the dictatorship is still an open wound, and that we need to keep talking about it. And I couldn't agree more. What are my qualifications, you might be wondering? Well, I'm a historian, I'm Brazilian, and I love cinema. And for this video, I'm collaborating with Heloisa Matias, a fellow Brazilian historian who worked in the Brazilian National Truth Commission, which investigated human rights abuses during the military dictatorship. We talked a lot about this film and what it means for the way we understand history, and hopefully this video will give you some context to understand The Secret Agent, especially if you're not Brazilian. We try to avoid spoilers as much as we can, but if you would like to be completely surprised by the film, maybe go watch it first and then come back to this video. Okay, let's get into it. When historians speak of archives, we imagine the smell of old paper, the bureaucratic stamp of a government censor in the corner of a page, or the endless corridors of the archives where the air conditioning is always set slightly too cold, or at least that's what I think of. These are the places where the official memory of a nation is stored, catalogued, and sometimes sanitized. But archives are never neutral. They are a collection of what survived, what was allowed to survive, and the stories we can try to reconstruct. In his latest film, The Secret Agent, director Kleber Mendonça Filho attempts to construct a different kind of archive and to rethink how we understand memory. The Secret Agent follows a widowed ex-professor who is fleeing political persecution in the northeast of Brazil in 1977, as well as a history student in the present who is researching the networks he was involved in and trying to reconstruct his story through the archives. The film stars Wagner Moura and offers a different narrative to the one I discussed in last year's video about Walter Salles and I'm Still Here. While Salles gives us the suffocating silence of the domestic sphere, Mendonça Filho gives us the noise, the paranoia, and the sun-drenched claustrophobia of the street. It is a film that argues history is written not just in laws and treaties, but in the nervous systems of the people who survived it. Archives and the making of memory are crucial in this film, which forces us to confront what and who are left out of the story. Armando, the main character, is hiding, working under a false name at a government facility, where people go to have their identity cards made and where personal documents are stored. This is relevant because he is using the time he is there to try to find out about his own mother, who he had never met, and who was mostly known as Índia, meaning indigenous woman. It is implied that she had been a semi-enslaved domestic worker who had been abused by her white employer, and that pregnancy had resulted in Armando, the protagonist. He knows nothing of her, she is absent from the archives and the story, but through her absence the film forces us to think of Brazil's history of abuse and erasure, especially towards women of color. To understand why this film feels the way it does, we must first look closely at the date. For a general audience, the Brazilian military dictatorship is often viewed as a monolithic block of repression, but in reality it had distinct seasons. By 1977, the regime led by President Ernesto Geisel had announced a policy of opening, a slow, gradual, and secure opening towards democracy. This creates a complex and contradictory context which the film captures brilliantly. The horrific torture of the Medici years, the early 1970s, was becoming less visible, yet the apparatus of state surveillance remained entirely intact. It was a time of confusion. The regime was supposedly loosening its grip on society, yet in April 1977, Geisel temporarily closed Congress and issued the April Package, a set of constitutional amendments designed to keep the opposition paralyzed. This is important. It explains why a character like Armando feels so lost. He's not running from a coup, which is a sudden event. He's running from a corrupt system that shifts its shape constantly. And crucially, he's not exactly being hunted by the government, but rather by an important businessman who has ties with the government. This is an important aspect of the dictatorship in Brazil that is sometimes left out of the narrative, the deep involvement of companies with it, and how economic and political interests intertwined. There are multiple examples of corruption throughout the film, at all levels and everywhere. Kleber Mendonça Filho is a filmmaker deeply interested in architecture. But while we usually associate the aesthetics of the dictatorship with the grey, brutalist ministries of Brasilia or the dark, windowless interiors of police stations and the DOPS, the Department of Political and Social Order, The Secret Agent subverts this completely. This is a film set in the sun of the Northeast, with the vibrant colors of Carnival and the humid, sticky heat of the coast, but it's still a threatening atmosphere. In The Secret Agent, Kleber Mendonça Filho turns the city of Recife into an accomplice. Also, and this was something that many Brazilians were talking about, especially people who are not from the area where the film is set, there is a surreal aspect to the film. There was an urban legend in the 1970s that a hairy leg with supernatural strength would roam around the city, mysteriously attacking people. If you're not Brazilian and you watched this and thought, what is going on? Rest assured that many of us in Brazil were too. If you're not from the area, you probably had never heard of the story of a hairy leg going around and committing crimes in the city. The story of the hairy leg quickly spread, and the press ran with it, publishing stories on it, probably to talk about the violence that was happening while avoiding censorship. The bizarre story spread and became part of local folklore. It has been interpreted as a metaphor for repression and institutional violence during the military dictatorship. And I think this is another reason why we need more stories like this, different perspectives.
It's important to highlight how dictatorships in 1960s Latin America valued the pretense of rule of law and democracy. Right after taking power, the Brazilian military wanted to legitimize their actions and issue the normative acts of the revolution. This was the first of 17 documents, later called institutional acts, diverse on several points, from civil rights and elections to student unions and everything else that seemed relevant for them to contain supposedly subversive movements that existed in Brazil. A new written constitution was issued in January 1967, but it was completely changed by the most famous of these normative acts, known simply as AI-5, published in December 1968. The AI-5 actually revoked civil rights, and its main effect was giving the state power to simply take people to detention centers and torture and kill them. And from 1968 to 1974, people did disappear, but they also resisted, creating clandestine organizations, working in student unions, creating clandestine newspapers, moving abroad, creating networks for helping people find their loved ones, and just try to survive the wars of the light years, as those became known. By the time Ernesto Geisel came to power in 1974, the military had spent a lot of time and resources on fighting organizations that they saw as threatening, but also reorganizing the political landscape and creating alliances that would help them to leave power without suffering any consequences. By 1977, there were legally only two political parties, the government party, named Arena, and the opposition, named MDB. The opposition was gaining traction and threatening the military by hastening the end of the regime. So the military evoked the AI-5 and closed Congress. So after months and months of threatening, Congress was reopened, and the amnesty law started to be discussed. The law was passed and offered amnesty to all military personnel involved in kidnapping, torture, and killing the very citizens that they were supposed to protect, but also the subversives, the members of those clandestine organizations that took arms, and in most cases pen and paper, to fight against the dictatorship. Most of the people who took part in those clandestine organizations were in their 20s and 30s, without any proper training in most cases, and like Marcelo or Armando, surviving on day-to-day small jobs, because they were in hiding, having to use fake identities. These were people who clearly were not in a position to fight eye-to-eye with a government that was completely defeated and willing to destroy them. These organizations were vital in the sense of showing the general public the brutality of the regime, and that there were people with courage enough to rise against those powerful men that took the government by assault and used institutions to commit crime. Not a single state agent was arrested or charged for the crimes, and only a few of them were even pointed as responsible for human rights violation, while over 400 people have been killed or disappeared, and countless people were arrested and harassed by the state. How is this even fair? In 1984, a few months before the end of the dictatorship, The Archbishop of São Paulo published the first book denouncing torture and kidnappings and persecutions during the dictatorship, inspired and titled In Honor of the Nunca Más Commissions in Argentina. They were by then arresting military personnel for their crimes in that country. 10 years later, in 1995, the law number 9410, known as Law of the Disappeared, allowed for the creation of a special commission on political deaths and disappearances, under responsibility of the Ministry of Justice, recognizing and listing the people who are missing, allowing their families to have access to a death certificate, so legal matters as selling property, registering children, divorcing, can be taken care of. This law also marks the first time the state recognizing their responsibility for the illegal acts that were committed during the dictatorship. But still, no formal steps were taken to revoke the amnesty law and formally recognize the armed force members involved in the crimes perpetrated during those years. In 2011, after decades of discussion, the Brazilian government officially announced the formal creation of a National Truth Commission, which started its work in 2012 to discuss the violation of human rights between 1946 and 1988. This commission was composed of 7 members and 14 additional employees. In all over the country, other commissions were created to investigate happenings in several states of Brazil. Many major cities, including Recife and federal universities, created their own commissions, and all of their findings helps the National Commission's work. Because of the amnesty law, it is impossible to actually formally prosecute any of the armed force members, but the main goal of the commission is understanding the violation of human rights, the network of spying and persecution created by the National System of Information between 1964 and 1985, collect oral and written evidence to identify the people responsible for financing the dictatorship and those responsible for the many, many horrible crimes committed against Brazilian citizens, and also listing actions that could be taken by the government to strengthen the protection of human rights in the country. Even though the men responsible for the terror of those 21 years can't be formally arrested, even if the armed forces continue to protect them, the Brazilian people now know that them are still alive, and we can still hope that someday the law will be overturned and these old men will finally be held accountable for their doings. It was incredibly moving to see the then President of Brazil, Dilma herself arrested and tortured as a young woman, received the final paper containing the findings of the commission, and seeing the names of her torturers there. I'll never forget the moment. I had the honor of working at the Truth Commission stalled at the Federal University of São Paulo, where I got my BA in History, collaborating with the Commission on their findings about repression in universities. This period in Brazilian history is still so present, when many people are still looking for clues about what happened to their loved ones, people passing by streets named after the torturers, and brutality and corruption still present in the armed forces. Documents are still hidden. This is why movies as The Secret Agent are so important. They ask us to think about what kind of country we want to be, while highlighting the dangers of not looking at our past.
Why are we seeing these films now, in the mid-2020s? It is impossible to disconnect The Secret Agent from the current political reality of Brazil. The secret agent of the title could be a literal character, sure, but it also suggests the lingering, invisible presence of authoritarianism in Brazilian society. Brazil remains an outlier in South America regarding transitional justice. Unlike Argentina, which put its generals on trial, or Chile, which has had a long public reckoning, Brazil passed the 1979 amnesty law. This allowed the military to step back into the shadows without facing prosecution. The torture centers were closed, but the torturers went home, collected their pensions, and died in their beds. Not all of them, though. This is recent history. Some of these people are still alive. The ghosts in Kleber's film are not metaphorical. They are real people who walked free, and the recent Bolsonaro presidency brought many of these questions back to people's minds. The Secret Agent is a film about memory and how we relate to it, what we remember, what we choose to forget. Perhaps this is most clear when we compare the 2 history students who, in present-day Brazil, are tasked with researching and going through the many documents and interviews of the time. One of them is distracted, uncaring, seemingly preferring to think about something else. The other student won't let go of the case. She wants to find out what happened. I think they encapsulate how Brazilians feel about this period in our history, either wanting to do the hard work or choosing comfort instead. In films about authoritarian regimes, it's clear how political violence and oppression cause deep trauma in a society. But the choices that society makes afterwards, including choosing to forget, also causes trauma. And arguably the only thing we can do to collectively heal is to talk about what happened, to remember. As Wagner Moura said in his speech, trauma can be passed down from one generation to the next, but so can values, and that means understanding how important it is to remember our past, and that gives me hope. Cinema is stepping in to perform the work that the state refused to do. By meticulously recreating the atmosphere of 1977, Mendonça Filho is forcing a confrontation with the past. He is filling the gaps in the National Archive with emotional truth, reminding us that the economic miracle was built on a foundation of silence and terror. The film is a tense, stylish thriller which feels deeply Brazilian. It demonstrates how easily a society can become a trap and how quickly a citizen can become a target. I find it fascinating to view The Secret Agent alongside I'm Still Here. It is a stroke of cinematic luck that two of Brazil's most important filmmakers have released distinct masterpieces on the dictatorship within months of each other. They can function as two halves of the same national trauma. I'm Still Here explores the experience of authoritarianism through a wife and mother whose husband disappears. It focuses on the home, the waiting, the raising of children, and the legalistic battle for truth. It is a film about staying. The protagonist, Eunice Paiva, refuses to be moved, both literally and metaphorically. The Secret Agent, arguably, is a film about running. Armando's story happens in the public sphere, in the university corridors, bars, and the city squares. Whereas Eunice had to be stoic to survive, Armando is restless. Of course, it would be too simplistic to think of this through a gender binary. After all, Armando is also a father. Both the absence of his mother and the presence of his son anchor him throughout the film. These two films tell complementary stories from a geographical perspective too, and I think that's interesting. I'm Still Here is set in Rio, which has traditionally dominated narratives about Brazil, alongside São Paulo, while The Secret Agent is set far away in Recife, which is too often left out of the story. I don't mean to fall into the trap of binaries again, though. In truth, we need more stories about this time in our history, told by different people from different perspectives. As historians, we often try to remain objective, even if that's impossible. We look for the paper trail, but The Secret Agent reminds us that history is also written in the body. It is recorded in the way a person checks the rearview mirror, the way they flinch at a siren, or the way they lower their voice when discussing politics in a crowded bar. And this history refuses to be forgotten. If you would like to learn more about this period in Brazilian history, you'll find lots of recommendations in the video description, including another video I did on the film I'm Still Here, as I mentioned. Also, please feel free to share your recommendations in the comments, whether for films, books, songs, or documentaries, especially if you are Brazilian. I would also like to thank Heloisa for collaborating with me on this video. And now, let's cross our fingers for the Oscars. Thank you, and see you next time.